Housing is a system that requires scarcity. Housing is constructed and demolished. It invites, it displaces. Housing is the heart that palpitates through the body of our built environment. It controls the ways we interact within our communities and across to others. Houses are constructed daily. Some are given new life through rehabilitation, and others are destroyed, leaving people to scatter and build home someplace else. We seek safeguards from these cycles of disruption and displacement. This security is a comfort not afforded to all. Scarcity is a poem this system writes and recites. Scarcity is at the core of our housing system, and the system works well for those with the resources to weather the storms of disruption and displacement. It works well for those that understand how to work it. Can you gain access to the front door of this housing system? Do you know the way through these corridors? Look out the windows and see the connections to our neighboring systems of finance, education, employment. When you make yourself at home here, it's all within reach. Scarcity is at the core of our housing system, and this system doesn't work well for those without the resources to weather the storms of disruption and displacement. With no margin for error, they can't find their way through the system's corridors. Windows are boarded, and bridges of finance, education, and employment become barriers. The homes we've made are swept away, and we are locked out of the system, searching for a way back in. unevictIA was born of a simple need to understand and engage our community in building a housing system that works for everyone. We believe that safe, affordable, and stable housing is a basic human right and the foundation of community. We invite you to join in our pursuit of knowing, dreaming, and building.
This idea of beloved community that we talk about in our programs is this taking care of folks and holding folks accountable and fostering this opportunities for everyone. So what are the opportunities so that everyone, based on their values, their hopes and dreams, that they can achieve something. And we are afraid so much in this society to talk about other people's hopes and dreams, because they think they might not be possible or they might not be attainable. It's a great job to be an advocate in a domestic violence program, because you get to have conversations every day with folks about what their hopes and dreams are. If you're brave enough to do it, and if you do it, then you get to be a part of walking along beside them or standing behind them as they figure out how to achieve them. And they do.
Systems are what we make of them. This is the essence of sociology. Every morning we all get up and decide to recreate the systems we live in. Of course, that's not a personal decision, is it? I mean, I can't decide that I want to change the system unless you decide you want to change the system too. And then if we're the only two people in the system, we can make a new one. But the problem is there are millions of us and there are interests in keeping it the same. A lot of people really don't want to change the system. They probably personally don't want there to be homelessness. But I personally believe that most people are good, fundamentally good people, and want the world to be a better place. Don't want to create suffering. If I really understood how these systems work, then I might push back against it. But broad systemic change is very difficult to achieve. And we see this over and over again. Every few years there's an opportunity for some broad systemic change. Last summer we saw a lot of people upset about the intersection of race and policing. And we've seen some minor reforms around that. But real systems change probably won't result from that. Yeah, so in sociology we understand how systems change works. Systems change is uncomfortable. It leads to situations that make people uncomfortable. And most people don't want that.
We've just spent the last year and a half helping thousands of people with non-payment cases. People in this country who are getting evicted, it's not like they're forgetting to pay the rent, okay? The eviction is a symptom of many underlying problems and instabilities, which were certainly the coronavirus pandemic sort of laid bare some of these disparities and vulnerabilities, but they've been with us for a long time. And so when you have families living precariously in basically like a juggling act, and many, if not most of our clients are what we would call working poor, there's no room for error. And so if there's a health issue, if there's something going on with the kids, if there's a domestic violence situation, those things ripple through to difficulty paying the rent. Now, a lot of people lost their job because of the coronavirus, but in more normal times, if there was such a thing, you have families living paycheck to paycheck where a broken car sets off a series of circumstances where the rent is behind and they're subject to eviction. And for many people that we work with, it's not their first time that they're getting evicted. And so all of those inequities and vulnerabilities that underlie the lives of our clients manifest themselves through the eviction. Now, the other thing about the housing is that it also ripples forward. And so if someone loses their house, it's kind of game over on all the other stuff they're trying to hold together, right? If you're lucky enough to keep your job, well, if you're not going to keep it for too much longer if you don't have a place to live, right? We work a lot with families with kids. Kids who get displaced have trouble in school. This is not new information. I mean, kids who are couch surfing or, living in motels do not come to school ready to learn in the morning. And so there's a lot of factors that go into this, many of which aren't just legal. There's a lot of social issues and resource issues that can lead to housing instability. And so it's both a cause and an effect in a way.
When we leave, Iowa doesn't leave us. Wherever we've wandered, so many come back home to find community.
I think what makes Iowa attractive is that this is still a state of smaller communities. One of the things that makes us really interesting is that there is no huge city here. So for people who have the interest in getting involved in their communities, it's really interesting. I have friends who've moved to other parts of the country. It takes them a long time to break into a career in Chicago or in New York or San Francisco. Here in our communities, you can become pretty involved and have an impact on what's happening in the community kind of surprisingly quickly. So just in terms of folks trusting you to work on issues and get involved and really do things, I think it's an interesting place to do this work. Because you have access, you can be talking with folks at the state government or in your city or, your nonprofit community or just some of the great activists that we have around here who are doing a lot of work. You can have contact with these people and you can get to know all of them. So if you really want to feel like you're on a team somewhere and your voice is important, there are a lot of places to plug in this community, which makes it interesting.
It is and it isn't, right? I mean, Des Moines is a great community, and historically, we've prided ourselves on our centrism. So you saw things like, when I was a kid, I remember Robert Ray, our governor, when we faced refugee crises, he would step up and volunteer Iowa as a place that was welcoming. And I applaud that. I believe in the idea of a welcoming community. I'm not sure we still are, but there are still elements in our community that are trying to make that the case. So I applaud those elements. And I see that there's a constant struggle to keep ourselves the kind of community that cares about the least among us. The people who need help have a harder and harder time getting it. I know our governor today is quite hostile to the idea of refugees and immigration from places that she finds scary. So we're no longer that community. We're no longer the state that elected Robert Ray. We are now the state that does whatever it is we're doing now. But I personally come from Iowa, love Iowa, went to school here, was raised here, and even though I went away after college, I came back when I had children, because ultimately it is the place that I know, that I know people where I find comfort.
Yeah, I came back. I mean, I spent time in California, and I came back, and it had to do with how families and communities connect. At our best, that is who we are in central Iowa and in Des Moines. There are a lot of potential things that can bring families together and bring communities together. But again, that is when we're at our best, and it's why I choose to stay.
Des Moines in particular for me, Iowa's always been home for me, so I guess I'm never leaving at this point probably. But Des Moines for me is big enough that there are things to do, but it is small enough that when I go somewhere, when I go to the farmer's market, I almost always see someone I know, and that's super important for me. And that somebody I know might be a client, it might be my neighbor, it could be somebody from my hometown, but like to know somebody and to have that connection into your community, I think is what's kept me here.
But the other thing that keeps me here is that I love this state. I grew up here, and that gives me the bones to criticize her and to know where we have space to grow. And I think that by staying in it and staying in the systems here to try and change them for the better for Iowans in general is something that definitely motivates me and keeps me going every day.
So I was actually born and raised here in Des Moines, Iowa, and I will continue to stay here in Des Moines. I actually want to go get my master's in another state, but I do want to come back. I want to stay here because of my family, but because Des Moines is growing and the Latino community is growing here as well. Soon enough, Latinos will be 1 in 5 here in Des Moines. So that is pretty big. And not a lot of people are talking about that, 1 in 5. And if you look around, there are not a lot of Latino organizations that are helping Latinos. So why would I go to another place when my people need me here, if that makes sense. I don't see a point of going to another city or another state when I can work here. I know the city, I know the people here. I know I can do something here. My my mentality has always been, I want to help at least one person in my life, make a change in the life of at least one person. It doesn't matter how I do it. I just want to do it. There's such a big need here, and we're so blind to it. So doing more of this community work, I realized, wow, there's a lot of work to do here in Des Moines. I didn't realize it. I wasn't aware, like, and I am a part of the Latino community. I wasn't aware that there's so many gaps.
I'm often confronted with the news and the information which identifies the great things about Des Moines, Polk County, Central Iowa, and those things are true, but they are not equitable. In other words, we have a lot of opportunities if you've had the right education. We have a lot of opportunities if you don't have any large barriers. It's a great place to live if you earn a living wage or above. What we're not talking about is the proportion of our community or the portions of our community that don't share in those same advantages, those same opportunities. And we have made an assumption, I think, sometimes as a community that those things are available to everyone if they just do a prescribed set of activities. And what we have seen is that's just inherently not correct. And while I do want us to celebrate what's great, I want us to celebrate what's going well, I think we have to be very, very focused on where that dream isn't a reality for so many people.
So the idea that Des Moines is a great place to live, an affordable place to live, especially post-pandemic, and I think that's true for a certain population. I think Des Moines is a wonderful and welcoming community for people who are on the lower end of professional positions. So, if you're coming in to work at a Wells Fargo or a principal, and you have a starting salary in the professional range, you're going to find exactly what you want in Des Moines. But below that, it becomes very difficult. Most housing construction decisions at that level are made, at least in part, based on tax rebates. So they target those rebates and those resources toward a certain kind of housing that they want to see. And so what we've seen is a lot of additional condos. I mean, everybody says, oh my God, there's so many condos downtown. And there are. How could you possibly fill all of those? And I thought for a while they couldn't, but they seem to be doing it. But what that means then is that the population that makes Des Moines, specifically Des Moines, can't afford to live here anymore. So you end up with a very narrow band of economic diversity. You end up with entry-level insurance jobs being most of your population in those regions, those areas downtown. So then your wealthier executive positions move out to the suburbs, and your poor people are left with very few options, if any at all. You end up with a lot of doubling up. It's very hard to measure. This is a very difficult population to measure. How many people are living in doubled up situations? There's a way to sort of approximate it with census data, but that always ends up being 5 or 6 years out of date at best, and then it's only an approximation. If I were to venture a guess, I would say the pandemic has doubled the number of people living in doubled up situations, but that's just a guess, an educated guess, but still just a guess. So that's what poverty looks like in Des Moines. People are in doubled up situations, they're in substandard housing, or they're moving out into apartment developments in the suburbs, and they end up spending most of their lives commuting. If you have a car, if not, then you spend your whole life commuting. So it becomes then a great town for a very limited number of people, and just where you're stuck if you're in the bottom.
In 1987, I found myself a single mom in California. And I had grown up in a family that really believed in equity and the idea that the American dream was alive and well. And so I had no idea when I went on this endeavor as a single mom what I would run into when I went to get assistance at a social service agency that was in California. And every time I went somewhere, I came out feeling worse than I did when I went in. People were disrespectful, they were unkind, they were judgmental, they made all kinds of assumptions, and it was painful. And I can remember after one specific incident at a Department of Human Services office, I walked out and said, this is what I'm going to do. I am going to spend my life making sure that no one feels the way I do. And that took me into the world of social work and human services and community action. And one of the reasons I love community action so much is we do look at direct service and delivery of service, but we also look at the systemic issues that are creating the issues our families are facing.
And I started out working in 2007 in Minneapolis as a tenant organizer. So I went around to Section 8 apartment buildings, knocked on people's doors, talked to them about issues they were facing in their buildings with landlords that weren't doing what they were supposed to doing, not fixing things or charging rent. And just like, I drank a lot of coffee. I don't really like coffee, but I drank coffee in community with folks, talked to them about landlords and about housing and about the challenges that they were facing. Low-income folks living in our subsidized housing programs faced a lot of challenges. At a lot of those conversations, I developed a passion for housing, thinking about housing, thinking about how our social safety net helps people and fails people every single day, all the time. But the interesting thing, all the tenant organizing, all of these conversations, all of the housing work, meeting in coalition, advocating for programs, the thing that we didn't talk about was domestic violence. It was a different siloed thing. And it turns out that the issues of homelessness and housing insecurity and domestic violence are extremely intertwined.
Everything for us starts with centralized intake, but we also have basic needs. So we have a shower and a clothing closet. We also have currently 13 case management programs that are running out of our department. We have 2 housing navigators, one focused on transition age youth, and then we have a street outreach worker who is out and about all the time, kind of meeting people wherever they are in camps and meal sites, here at the library, just kind of wherever, trying to wrap around services and make sure that there's no barriers to accessing any of the services in the community.
And then like from a primary healthcare wide standpoint, then like Shelby mentioned before, since we're a federally qualified health center, we also do behavioral health, medical services, dental services. We also have the Project of Primary Healthcare, which serves people that have a diagnosis of HIV or AIDS. And so we serve kind of the entire person. So in addition to just the Homeless Support Services Department, PHC serves the person as a whole.
And we love our building because we're the one-stop shop. So all of those things are in our building. So if somebody comes in and like has something going on with their foot, I can walk them to the medical clinic and make that warm handoff. And what we know is that the warm handoff is sometimes everything in the follow-through.
What I do is I feed homeless, and they are on the street of Des Moines, under the bridges of Des Moines, in the woods. And I've just formulated a crew, volunteers. People can do probation hours with us. Churches, schools, young kids, older people, disabled people. There's a group of us, and we do this on a daily basis. We happen to provide supplies that are 100% donated from the community, and they get 100% put back into the community. And it happens to save Mother Earth. And a lot of people happen to tell us that these items would go to the trash. So we're doing kind of, you know, on both sides. I'm a person and a research person and a service person for someone that wants to give and for someone that is in need.
What is the role of legal aid in our community, in our society?
Well, it's actually quite critical. I mean, Iowa Legal Aid is the only statewide provider of civil legal services for people who can't afford a lawyer. Mm-hmm. Now, that's much more than most people think, right? The law is woven into every aspect of our lives in America. And so particularly for people living in poverty. The latest literature suggests that about 71% of those people will have one or more civil legal problems every year. And maybe not to be too clinical about it, when I say civil, that's kind of like everything that's not criminal, like except speeding tickets. Like we don't do that. But so we're talking about housing issues, landlord-tenant, public benefits, family law, domestic violence, consumer issues. But we close about 15,000 cases a year, and that involves about like 32,000 people. So we operate all across the state in many areas. We do bankruptcy, we work with veterans, we have programs in schools, we have clinics in hospitals, we have a senior hotline, we work with people recovering from natural disasters, which is unfortunately with climate change, I think that's going to be an issue that's with us to stay for quite some time now. We're still working on last year's derecho, for example. So it's kind of all over the place, but I think to what we're talking about today, housing is a through line through all of the work that we do. It's hard to think of too many cases that we work on where some sort of housing instability isn't present. Be that because someone can't afford it, or because the house is in disrepair, or there's a family law issue that's preventing someone from achieving stability. So it's kind of in our DNA to work on housing issues.
When a survivor, someone who's experienced domestic violence, applies for an apartment, that survivor should know that they aren't going to be denied because they're a victim of domestic violence. Not have to worry about disclosing to their landlord, hey, I experienced domestic violence. I'm afraid for my safety. If I tell you these things, though, are you going to refuse to rent to me? Because right now the landlord in Iowa could do that. So we need these policy changes and protections that defend the rights of folks who are just trying to get to those hopes and dreams. I think so often it's the person who has the money or the resources to have the attorney to show up in court to push for the landlord side, when overwhelmingly folks facing eviction, folks risk of losing their home don't have an attorney, don't know what their rights. So we have this massive imbalance. We're talking about something so severe as somebody losing their safety, their security, their home. They at least deserve to have a landlord, to have those protections. I think there's some great other places in the country that Des Moines could model on to see it, so that evictions, Polk County in Iowa, that everybody facing eviction at least gets an attorney, because the landlords almost always have an attorney, and the folks facing eviction don't. So.
More than I think. What we do is a culturally specific program. That means we have linguistically, we speak in between those 9 staff, we speak between 12 to 15 languages. Some of us are fluent in 3, others are fluent in 7 languages. So that's combined. We don't look more of the languages that we don't have. We contract with people that within the community who speak that language, who are like we train in confidentiality and consent form and all, like appropriate way of dealing with survivors, because that's a very sensitive topic when we talk of domestic abuse and sexual assault within our community, because it's not recognized that much within the community. Then we develop relationship with a mainstream organization and religious leaders, religious maybe be it church or mosque, all of those. And then we say we are bridge between the system and our survivors.
Yeah, so Umpan Camino is a new program that started right after COVID-19 hit. It first started to, we saw that there was a need within the students. So once COVID-19 hit and students had to go, online, we realized that a lot of them didn't have access to internet, didn't have access to laptops. So we decided to do something about it. So we began to set up internet for them, give them laptops throughout the school year. I believe we partnered with TMPS for that, and we also provided tutoring services. But we realized that not only the students were in need, but also their families. So we then began to give out food every week. So since 2020, we have given out about $1 million to the Latino community. We began giving out food, and then recently, this summer, we started helping out with financial assistance for rent, utility, and medical bills that were incurred due to COVID-19.
Income with housing is everything. Because the moral of the story is that people with mental health and people with substance use successfully live in housing all the time. So that's not the make or break piece of that. At one point in time, ICA, the Institute for Community Alliance, was able to extrapolate data to say that about 49% of the people who enter homelessness enter for a primary reason related to an economic, whether that be I lost my apartment, I was underemployed, I lost my job. It's so much of it is income, and the pandemic has shown us, one, that the service industry is continuing to be challenging for our folks, and that's a lot of the employment opportunities, but also the decrease in the number of landlords and the more stringent rental criteria has only made income become more important. You know, you need 3 times the rent and income. So if your apartment is $750, I don't know anybody who has that type of income. So it's become, more present to us, the need for income, and it's really hard to get a job when you're experiencing homelessness also. Like that, when you're trying to figure out where you're sleeping at night, the employment piece of that is secondary.
If you don't include notions of equity and inclusion at the beginning of the planning process, you will wind up with exactly what you'd think, which is a bunch of people chasing a buck, and that results in displacement. And it's going to be a system that favors those who can afford to buy in, and you see shiny new housing going up, like we see all around us, at the expense of, that's pushing people to the margins. That's pushing people outside of the community services that they might be able to access. And frankly, it's disrupting communities that exist of, neighborhoods. And certainly New York is the destroyer of neighborhoods. And the story of New York is the story of America in this one regard. It's just development favors the wealthy and pushes out those who can't afford to come along. And, there are entire neighborhoods in New York City that were there for decades and decades that there's now a highway running through it because people thought that was urban blight and that was a bad neighborhood. Let's put a road there. Des Moines is no different, right? 235 used to be a neighborhood, right? A neighborhood where black people lived, and now it's a road. And that is a story that gets told again and again and again in this country. And so it's a choice. That's the lesson of New York. It's a choice. What do you want to do with the city? The city is an opportunity, right? And particularly, even as Des Moines gets bigger, it's small. And so these issues, the people you're talking about, they're not in some other world. They're 2 blocks away. My perspective from New York, right? People say 6 degrees of separation. I can say, well, I always want like 2 degrees of separation, right? And so, the person who's impacted by the choice you made knows somebody else that you know, right? Why does it matter, the work we do helping people with their issues? Because that might be the person who's mowing your lawn. That might be your babysitter. That might be someone who's a member of your family. It might be one of your employees, right? It's right there. And so if you want this to be a great place to live, work, and play, like all the corporate interests like to say, you better bring everyone else along, or this community will never thrive. And the absence of fairness and opportunity is the presence of discord and dysfunction. And, anyone can tell you that, like, people don't want to live someplace that doesn't reflect the values that they want, right? People have a very mobile lifestyle right now. So this town's trying to get up on a bigger stage to get to that next level. Those millennials not going to come work here if they don't feel like there's some skin in the game around equity and inclusion. And housing is where the rubber meets the road, because we can all hire our DEI coordinators and talk about how great we are, but until you invest the resources in giving someplace an affordable, safe place to live so that they can make their contributions to our society, we're all going to be held back.
Poverty is oftentimes attributed to bad decision making or poor life choices. And the truth of the matter is it's not. And that's never more clear than with the population we study. Even though the data points that we use don't necessarily point to it. We collect data that suggests exactly those ideas you're getting at, that it's a decision. Like, we have a data point we collect that is, what is your first and secondary causes of homelessness? And all the choices are specific to the individual. So, I lost my job, or I experienced this, or I experienced that. But the truth is, that's not how it works. It's a systemic failure, and it's at the intersection of multiple systems. So I can see that in my data, but I have to look at it a special way. And one advantage of having now been doing this for 12 years or so, and we have about 15 years of data to look at historically, is I can see who becomes homeless over a long course of time. And you would think that if there was a lot of churn in homelessness, which is something you hear a lot, that there's a lot of churn, that people are coming in and out of homelessness, but it's the same people over and over again. That's simply not true. The idea then is that if you take 1 year's worth of population experiencing homelessness, how many multiples of that do you get across 10 years? So if it was a same people coming in and out over and over again, it would be the same people every year, and you would get 10 times. But the actual number, if you stretch that one across 10 years, it's closer to maybe 1.5 or 2 tops, probably closer to 1.5. What we end up really getting is a different homeless population every year. There are some people, though, who are in what we call chronic situations. And those are going to be the people that meet your traditional understanding of what homelessness looks like. Those are going to be people who have mental health disabilities, or substance abuse disabilities, or other kinds of disabilities. And for those people, there's special resources available. Most people, though, who become homeless are homeless for a brief period of time, a finite period of time. It may be a year, but it's still restricted. And they're homeless one time, one episode. So they may come in and out of homelessness 3 or 4 times over that year. False starts as they try to establish stability. But we can see that when we stretch it out over 10 years, like I'm describing, it's not. It's not those people filling up the whole population. So what does that mean? That means that within the broader population experiencing poverty, at the bottom you have this band of people who are in extreme forms of poverty. And we have a finite housing stock, but a slightly larger population that can't afford anywhere to live. So that gap is always going to be homeless, which is why the homeless numbers are fairly static. For all of our effort, we can't really seem to move the numbers that much, because ultimately, at the end of the day, it's a structural issue, and there's just always going to be some gap. And it's not something we can address very easily, because that gap is brought on by the need to have scarcity. If you don't have that scarcity, then the top of the market doesn't function the way the top of the market wants to function. And who's making the decisions about how the housing market functions? Well, it's the top of the market.
One thing that is key to broadening everyone's understanding of the issue that surrounds income challenges and financial challenges and families is to learn and do some basic math. I'm often found saying, why are people poor? It's a mathematical issue. And it's not about blaming the person, but instead looking at the mathematical reality. You brought up the term budgeting. We often say at Impact, you cannot budget your way out of poverty. Now, we do know that there are some things that people can do to help their budget, but the families we're seeing, it's not that they don't know how to budget their money. They don't have enough money to budget. And so when you sit down and look at what it actually costs to live here, actually costs to eat, to have reliable transportation, to get health care, child care, there are great resources out there that show us exactly how much it costs, and then lay that up against what people are earning, and you'll see it's not an individual moral problem, it's not an individual decision-making problem, it is a mathematical problem that we as a community need to be aware of and to embrace and start problem solving. I think there's two choices. Either we ensure that all work is great and honorable and pays enough for someone to meet their basic needs, or we build a social safety net that is truly a social safety net to ensure that everyone can access those basic needs.
When you use words like affordable housing or workforce housing, you give people the opportunity to kind of picture who they think you're talking about. And so you end up in debates about kind of, well, what do you mean by that? When you talk about workforce housing, for some people, the workforce they're trying to attract here in cities, in the city and in cities around Des Moines and its suburbs, would be, let's say, computer programmers who get paid $120,000 a year, something like that. And so that's a workforce housing issue for maybe that company that employs those folks. That's not necessarily the population that we're seeing struggle, obviously. So we have to kind of lead a conversation that's looking at the workforce that's earning hourly wages and look at that the people who are falling into the gap, where even if you're working full time, you don't have enough money to pay the rent and childcare and all of the other expenses that come into it for you. And so, part of what we have to do is really be realistic about who our workforce is in this community and who are the working people and what struggles are they having. And I think that's a place where we've had to sort of try to bring some reality to it. Wages right now are moving in an upward direction, but look, you can be earning twice the minimum wage in our community and still really be struggling to pay the rent every month. And I don't think many people who aren't living that day-to-day experience really often sit down and process what that would mean to live with those financial constraints. So part of what we're trying to do is say to folks, we need to talk about the real wages that are being paid and the real situations that working people and families find themselves in. And we need to have a conversation about how folks can have a reasonably successful, safe, stable existence in our community on numbers where, frankly, things don't tend to add up.
Because so much of homelessness is linked to trauma. For our folks, it's domestic violence, sexual assault, abuse are all traumatic things that folks experience. The experience of eviction and homelessness, those are traumatic experiences that then compound. Every day that folks are spending, whether it's in a shelter, even if it's the best, safest shelter in the world, that is a traumatic experience, whether you're worried about folks taking your stuff, going through security line, not knowing who else is out to get you. All of these things are traumatic experiences and they compound on top of each other.
Is that when you're at a much lower income level, that 30% leaves no room for something coming up that you didn't have planned. That happens every month. So somebody gets sick, the car breaks down. Things fall apart when that happens, right? And so, it goes back to that sort of, could you come up with $400 if something unforeseen came up? Well, when you're at that income level and you're paying 30%, no. You have no possibility of, forget accumulating wealth. I'm talking about just accumulating an amount of money that could get you out of a jam that invariably is going to happen, right? Kids, if you have kids, they will get sick. I can tell you from personal experience. It's a fact of life. Send them to school, they'll get sicker. But things happen. People die. You need to give them a funeral. It's just any little thing. So it goes to that notion of part of stability is having a margin for error, and you can't get there.
Community has the power to connect us, welcome, include, and make room for us to build home. Community also has the power to disconnect, exclude us, and leave no room for us to belong.
Community to me means a sense of belonging. Personally, I find it in like the Mexican stores I go to. I think of Latino. I think of the East Side here near the Capitol and near East High School. When I go to these stores, I feel so at home and I feel so comfortable. I walk in and I feel like I belong. I think about like, this is kind of off topic, but I think about when I first started college and being first generation and going to Grandview University. My first classes, I remember looking around me and thinking, all of these people are white and that there's not one single person of color in here, not one single person that looks like me. And I remember going home and feeling like I did not belong whatsoever at all. And I felt so lost. And that first semester, I wanted to drop out. I thought I was not capable because I didn't see anyone like me. So when I go to these places, I feel so at home. I feel so comfortable. Or when I go to Walmart on the South Side and I see a lot of people that look like me, I feel comfortable. I feel fine. I think that's why it's so important to have an organization like this, Alexito. That's something we strive for as well, especially with the youth. We want them to know that there are people out there that look like them. That people that go to college that look like them, people that are community leaders that look like them, educators that look like them, so that they don't ever have to feel like that they don't belong, like how I did that first semester at Grandview. It really is an awful feeling. It's a feeling. It really is a feeling I will never forget, because I remember I just thought I was not good enough.
Urban living is a great thing because it's about shared space, and it's green if done properly. It's communal. I mean, I don't know how you replicate. Like, what do I love about New York? The subway, right? Like the subway, everybody takes the subway. There's an element of density that's needed for that, but it encourages a lot of positive behaviors when you have that sort of core. The kind of ownership that people have of communities when they're there and they're invested, that to me is what really is lacking, is give people some skin in the game. People love to build their neighborhood, just let them have a stake.
Sometimes some landlords reject our people. That's the reality. The reality of like, sometimes if I have a big accent, of course. I work with people and I push a lot of buttons. Sometimes my accent will let me not get the apartment that I want. But if I ask a fellow who doesn't have that accent, sometimes we get that apartment. And when they see someone who is either like an immigrant who have a big accent or wearing a scarf, sometimes you don't get that apartment. That's the reality. Let's be, I'll be blunt in that area because I have seen that a lot. So there is some areas that people, even if they can pay, they cannot get into those apartments sometimes.
When we think about historical trauma and we think about the injustices that have occurred and continue to occur, I'm not sure that we are, as a society as a whole, as a culture as a whole, willing to really face those things yet. I would love to think we were. However, there is proof that we are not. When you turn to social media, you turn to a wide variety of media, and you look at all the sides that are talking at any given time, you will see that there is a large portion of our society that still or chooses to believe that equal access is a thing, that equal opportunity is a thing, that we all start at the starting line, and it's just what we do with those things. And those are inherently not true. And trying to get people to understand that they're not true has been a very challenging battle. And that education, I think, has to start young and be consistent and be thorough and throughout. But as long as we are attacking things like critical race theory, which actually isn't even taught in our elementary schools, but as long as we're focused on what we shouldn't be doing instead of what we should be doing, it's a problem. I would love to believe that we are making turns around that. But even in the current situation, when I address groups of people or talk to folks in different mediums about poverty and how that affects people and how it is a trap, there are still a large number of people who believe if the individual just did this recipe of things, that everything would be okay. And so getting people to understand that there is a systemic issue, that we have created systems that continue onward. Until we can get a critical number of people understanding that, I think it's a difficult leap.
And so much of our system is about disconnecting from people experiencing homelessness who are already disconnected. That just our system is set up to further disconnect them, to hide them from public view, to take them out of community, to deny them access to bathrooms, to deny them access to shower, like just the basic necessities of folks. Because that's what an eviction is taking somebody away from those things that allow them to connect in community, a place to brush their teeth, to close their eyes at night and feel like I'm home, I'm safe, like just that, the feeling of coming home to a place of safety and rest so that you can go back and be your best self in the world. And when we evict people or folks experience a homelessness, that's what they lose out on, is that opportunity to figure out how to present them their best selves to the world. And then we further isolate them and disconnect them. And so how are we inviting people back into community to get to know folks and connect with folks?
The experience of inclusion, community, and access is different based on the depth of your wallet, the color of your skin, the ways you dress, the accents you carry, the papers you hold, and how you move your body through space. Access is an invisible experience that you're only aware of when you lack it. When you have stable housing, heat in the winter and air conditioning in the summer. When you have hot and cold water, reliable transportation. When you have health insurance, savings to support you through emergencies. When you have a family or neighbor that can care for your child. These are forms of material and social capital. It's access through the corridors of the interwoven systems of health, housing, finance, education, and employment. So many things we enjoy without a second thought until we don't have them. What do you do when you're locked out? The windows are boarded. The bridges are barriers. How do you cope with a fall, a blow to the head, when you don't have health insurance or savings or a job that offers PTO and paid sick leave? How do you recover when there is no margin for error?
It is. I literally think about that every single week, about what can I say to the community, because like you said, they have almost no empathy towards the undocumented community, and it breaks my heart, especially when I read the news. That was a big problem I used to have. I used to cry sometimes when I would read the comments. Their families too. That's all I can think of. Their people and their families too. And they have grown up here and they call this Des Moines, Iowa. They call this place their home too, even though they weren't born here and even though they have another home in another country, this is their home to them too. They have created a life here and they have kids and houses and cars, pets, and have created a whole life here. So it's so, you know, it breaks my heart because I think about my parents who, sorry, it's it was it's heartbreaking to see, especially after after Trump came into office, how dehumanizing people could be towards brown people just because they don't have a paper that says that they're allowed to be here. So I remember thinking, my parents at the time had no legal status, and now they do. Now they do. So I remember thinking, and I wish I could scream to these people, my parents are human too. My parents have a family here. My parents' life is here. My parents have created a home here. This is their home too. You know? That's what I would say. That this is their home too. And that a paper that indicates whether you're allowed to be here or not shouldn't give you the right on how to treat, you know, a person. And it's heartbreaking how these people are so quick to assume as well that just because you look a certain way that you're not here legally. But yeah, I would say this is their home too. And they have a right to be here because they've created lives here. And a lot of these people, a lot of these families that are here and documented, these parents, by now, they have lived here over half their life in the United States. And leaving their home countries and leaving their parents and sometimes kids that they've had over there, it's not easy. They don't do it just to do it. It's a hard thing to do, so.
I stood in a valley as the sky ripped like a caught plastic bag and the rain fell on me like realization. I asked myself to be a home but couldn't understand the question. I asked the soil to protect me, but it was drowning and didn't get words out. I asked the clouds to pause their overture, but wet reprise was my reply. Why can't I be afforded the same life as the bees that have a hive and the ants that protect each other?